Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Melinda Smith, and I'm the Executive Director at HelpGuide. Welcome to our panel discussion about life after COVID and the opportunity we have to rethink old routines and prioritize our mental health. Before we begin, let's start with a few housekeeping items. First, a quick disclaimer. This webinar is for educational and supportive purposes only. It is not intended to be therapy or treatment. If you need more help, please visit the HelpGuide website at the link you see on screen. You'll find an international directory of mental health services, crisis lines, and resources. A recorded version of this webinar will be available, and we'll send it out to you as soon as it's ready. Now, following the panel discussion, we'll have a Q&A. So if you have any questions while we're speaking, feel free to add them in the chat, and we'll get to as many as we can. And now I'd like to extend a warm welcome and heartfelt thank you to our panel of experts. Thank you so much for being here. Our first panelist is Dr. Carrie King, a licensed clinical psychologist in Culver City, California. She provides individual and family psychotherapy to children, adolescents, and adults, and conducts neuropsychological evaluations. Areas of expertise include ADHD, anxiety, ASD, learning, and parenting. She also maintains a position on the advisory board of Zuga Yoga for Kids, which that sounds very interesting, and she trains its employees to better understand student mental health and classroom management. Next, we have Dr. Karen Wilson, clinical neuropsychologist, director of West LA Neuropsychology, and an assistant clinical professor in the Medical Psychology Assessment Center at the Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Behavior at UCLA. She's the founder of Child Nexus, a digital platform that connects children struggling with learning, processing, and social emotional challenges with qualified professionals. She also hosts the podcast, Diverse Thinking, Different Learning. And last but not least, we have Dr. Stephanie Mihalas, a licensed and board-certified psychologist and a nationally certified school psychologist. She's an assistant clinical faculty member at the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA. She's also the founder of the Center for Wellbeing in Los Angeles, where she provides individual and family therapy to children, adolescents, and adults. And we're also very fortunate to have Dr. Mihalas on the HelpGuide Board of Directors. So thank you all for being here and for taking the time to share your insights and expertise.
Pleasure.
Thank you for having us.
Yes. So today we're going to talk about what's happening right now as we transition back to normal after over a year of pandemic living. Many people are feeling anxious as things open up because they don't want to go back to the old normal. So, let's jump right in. Our first question is about anxiety over reentry and all the different elements about that. So we've been in our quarantine cocoons for so long, and now the world is opening up. What can we do about anxiety over reentry?
Well, I think one of the first things we can do is just acknowledge that the anxiety exists. There was a poll from the American Psychological Association. They've been kind of studying adult stress during this time, and 84% of adults report experiencing at least one emotion that's associated with stress, and over 40% report anxiety. And so I think just acknowledging and validating that emotion is probably the first step. And then normalizing it to an extent, because when you're talking about 84% of adults having this emotion, it's not unusual given the circumstances that we've faced over the past year. And, even though we're transitioning to this post-pandemic, and I put that in quotes, life, Americans are, at least here, are still hesitant, and probably in other places as well, about the future. And that's regardless of vaccination status. There's still uneasiness about adjusting to in-person interaction once the pandemic ends. And I think the first step is just validating, acknowledging where we are, that these feelings exist and they're very common, and then moving into the next step.
Do you find the anxiety, there's an element of anxiety over safety issues for a lot of people. But then there's also anxiety over, completely separate emotional issues about lifestyle and routine. How have you seen that in your practices?
So I think that there are kind of a variability in what's happening with people and their emotions as it relates to anxiety and depression, and also excitement and jubilance over what's transpiring. And I think, like Dr. Wilson said, there's this kind of ideology of acceptance and honoring where we're at, both within ourselves and the collective and community around us. And so I think people are at various different kinds of stages in their process of this quote new normal. And the new normal, I think that we're all saying in quotes, is different for everyone. There's not really this normal anymore for anyone, because normal isn't really normal. And it's this acceptance and this process for everyone that I don't know what normal is, but normal for me is kind of okay. So normal for me, maybe I may be masked for the rest of my life. Normal for the next family, maybe we don't believe in masking, and that's okay. And so this kind of process of moving in and out of fluidity is where the ability to accept our emotions is going to be very helpful, and will allow us to settle in and maybe be less anxious one moment and maybe more anxious the next, because it's that fluidity that's going to allow us to learn how to be with our emotions as we settle into this kind of new state of post-pandemic life.
Mm-hmm.
I would add that anxiety tells us that everything is urgent. Anxiety tells us this is a very big deal. It's going to last forever. Fix it now. And so we have to fight against that pull and remember we could have time. We can take our time. We can think. We can talk to the people in our bubble. Maybe it's not urgent, right? Maybe what we do about soccer this weekend and wearing masks or not wearing masks, we don't have to do next weekend. So talking back to anxiety, I think in that way also helps. I can make a decision for today, just for today. It doesn't have to be what I do in July. People who are asking me to engage with you in July, for example, right? So we can just do what feels right now, even though anxiety says, figure it out, tell everybody what you're going to do all summer. What are you going to do in the fall when school starts? And I'm not sure that that's necessary in many cases.
Mm-hmm. Well, that kind of brings up the point of peer pressure. As things are opening up, the guidelines aren't super clear and everybody has their own comfort level. So, there's a lot of people that are feeling pressured by family or friends or maybe even work to do things they're not comfortable with or that really makes them feel unsafe. What is your advice for, those situations? We can start with Dr. King.
Is it too simple to say care less what other people think?
No.
Probably. Probably too simple. Although I think that's really, if we could do that, right? If we could listen to ourselves, talk with the people in our families and our bubble, and figure out or refigure out what are our values, what are our priorities, what are we reading, what are we hearing, how are we thinking we can keep ourselves safe. I think if we establish all of that, I'd like us to care less what other people think. That would be nice. I know that's a lot to ask.
I think that's actually a lot to ask. And I think in a perfect utopian world, we would want that. But I know that at least what I've been hearing and many people have been experiencing is this tremendous pressure and increased social anxiety to revert back to what was. And a lot of people, kind of this veil has been lifted. And a lot, I've been speaking with Dr. Wilson about this, is like, I don't like what was. I actually have seen sides of people I don't like. I'm going back to this mommy pressure, this daddy pressure, this mean girl pressure, and I don't want to be involved with that anymore. But people don't know how to navigate that. And so I think it's a lot about learning how to engage in assertiveness skills that maybe weren't there before, learning self-advocacy that wasn't existent before. And that actually may require some training. You know, is that reading self-help books? Is that getting a coach? Is that speaking to your pastor or your rabbi? I mean, what does that actually entail? But I'm not sure that it's as simple as like not careless, but maybe it requires connecting with another mother and learning how to do that. But I do think it requires some support, because I think a lot of people are saying, I don't want to do what I used to do. And I don't like a lot of people anymore, or I don't like the old lifestyle I used to have.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd love to piggyback on that, because I think that that is so true. And I think this is just such a great opportunity for everyone to take a collective pause and just take stock of where we are, what has happened over the past year, and just ask ourselves, you know, okay, what am I feeling in this moment right now? What are my hopes for moving forward? And then as you're thinking about this past year, what has been working well during this time? What have I learned about this period of time in my life? What do I want to continue doing? And maybe that's having dinner every night with your kids and you didn't do that before, or picking them up after school when you didn't do that before. So what do you want to continue doing? It might be exercising, it might be eating healthy foods, it might be getting adequate sleep. And then we also have to ask, what do we want to stop doing? Or maybe there was something that we were doing pre-COVID that no longer serves us, and we do not want to go back to that. And so again, piggybacking on Dr. Mihalas's point about self-advocacy and advocating for what it is that you need at this particular point in your life is tremendously helpful. And I think we're at a critical point where we can do that right now, as people are making decisions about what next steps are going to be.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a golden opportunity. It reminds me of when I talk to high school seniors and I'm saying, look, I promise you, you know, this is going to be better next year because you get to make a new you, right? There's no rules. It doesn't matter what you've been doing. You know, this is such an opportunity to figure out what you care about, to draw new boundaries, to figure out, like you're saying, you know, your goals. And so it just reminds me of that process. We really do have permission to take this moment to look at all of it and figure out what we want to do.
Mm-hmm. Have you found, you know, I know all of you work quite a bit with children and adolescents. What kind of differences have you seen between children and adults, or not?
I have found that children, for the most part, are actually more excited to get back in the game. They're excited to be back in school and doing extracurriculars. I think for the most part, you know, that's like a generalized statement. I'm finding that adults that I'm working with, and then also, you know, both personally and professionally, they're having a more difficult time. They are more socially anxious. They're more preoccupied with the fact that they don't want to get back into the hustle culture. They want to engage differently with work. They're feeling the pressure of people wanting to network with them again, go to coffee and do all these things. And they're like, whoa, I'm still on the yellow light here, or maybe even in the orange light, and everyone's already green. And so we're having conversations of, how do I navigate this without seeming like I'm a hermit, but I also don't want to do this again? So it's exactly what, you know, Dr. King and Dr. Wilson were saying, that the adults really are trying to figure out how to navigate this much more than the children. I think that there was a sense of resiliency and tenacity that the children had that were a little bit different than the adults. That's at least was my experience. I'm not sure what the other two psychologists are experiencing.
Yeah.
I've seen it all, right? I mean, you've got your kids who are anxious about rejoining. You've got your kids who couldn't be more excited. And then you've got your kids who aren't interested.
Mm-hmm.
And so all of those, I think, require a different response in parenting, or, you know, as therapists, we're the goals are different. You're looking at a different method to help them.
So when you say not interested, what do you mean? That they, either way, they don't care?
Well, I think that I guess the kids I'm thinking of who are not interested may have been socially anxious before. Socializing is hard for them.
Mm-hmm.
So staying home was a relief. So they're not really anxious about getting back out there, but why? Right? I've had a really nice year.
Mm-hmm.
This has been, and it's a lot of it's been on screen where I'm more comfortable. And there's a little more distance between me and other people, or we can keep the relationship. I can keep the relationship under control. I know what it's going to be about. I know what's going to happen here. It won't go too deep, or all kinds of things. And so they're not motivated to pull away from the screen or whatever they were doing at home and get back out there.
Mm-hmm. Well, so kind of going off of that, this is a great opportunity for us to rethink how we do things. But what do you do if, you decide you want to maintain your slower pace or that better work-life balance, but the systems around you aren't supporting that? Maybe your employer is pushing for, full-time back in the office. What kind of advice do you have for people who are dealing with that? Maybe we could start with Dr. Wilson.
Yeah, I think it begins with a conversation. First, with realizing, again, continuing with that conversation about realizing where you are, what it is that your needs are, and how those needs may have changed over the past year. And having a real conversation first with yourself and your family about those needs moving forward, and then your employer. I think there was a recent poll that showed that nearly half of remote workers say that if they had to return to their offices, they'd prefer a hybrid arrangement. And what that means is that a lot of employers are going to have to reconfigure their expectations. And that means discussing and having conversations with employees about what their expectations are moving forward. And so I would say to people to not assume that it is not a possibility, because our world has changed in significant ways, but you won't know if it is a possibility until you ask. And so I think having those conversations with employers, with colleagues, is extremely important. And I think it also, for many of us, I think it's been a privilege to be able to work from home when that has not been possible for so many other people who've worked in different workspaces. And so some people might feel that they shouldn't be asking for this type of arrangement for themselves. But if it's something that you need and it's something that you desire, then you should absolutely ask for it, because your needs won't met unless you ask for what it is that you need. Mm-hmm. And I think that, there's just, again, it's an opportunity to rethink the work environment and what that looks like and what that means. And I think caregivers are facing a crisis right now, particularly working parents. And what will that workplace look like for them? And how do we accommodate their needs as well? So I think there's a lot to be thinking about moving forward, and it all starts with the discussion.
Mm-hmm. So on the flip side, what if, you are able to maintain these new habits, but, things are going to get so different. Things get busier. Things are just going to change. How do you what kind of advice could you give to people to avoid just falling back into those old unhealthy habits? Dr. Mihalas?
Well, I've already started. I'm already using the word no frequently. I have a sign on my wall that says, "You can say no." So I think actually using visual cues is pretty important. I know it sounds silly because we say that to our children a lot, or children with different neurodevelopmental disabilities. We say, like, use visual cues, but actually we can use them as adults pretty frequently. So we can put up signs to remind us. You can say no, set boundaries. Do you? So I have Post-it signs all over the place to remind me, kind of that step one. Another thing that we do with children that we can also do with adults is actually schedule. so we can activity schedule for ourselves. So what I have done and what my family has done is we are setting times throughout the week that we did during, the height of the pandemic that we are translating over now, which includes family time, which we want to make sure that we don't get rid of. And we always did an art project during the height of the pandemic that we're continuing through post-pandemic, that we want to maintain, because that really created a very close, cohesive infrastructure. And then a third thing that really created cohesiveness within our family was a walk. I don't, at least here in California, we saw so many people walking, which wasn't really that commonplace pre-pandemic, and that's something we wanted to maintain for our physical health as well as our mental health. So kind of activity scheduling, I think, is another recommendation that families can also do. And so kind of creating that structure, activity scheduling, as well as visuals can really help both adults as well as children.
I would say another thing to schedule is just the checking in with yourself. So checking in with yourself to say, do I like how this is going? And people do that already, people who pray every night, or people who do a gratitude list every night, or people who wake up every morning and say, what is my goal for today? Families who already have a family meeting on Sunday, so people already do this a lot in their own ways, but it's a perfect opportunity to just look at how everything is going, right? So, and we might not do it if we don't set aside the time to do it. You just get in it and you find you're just going.
And I think by doing all of those things, what you're doing is you're really prioritizing, your self-care and the care of your family. And I think that's one of the things that has come front and center for so many families, is that in order to be physically healthy, you also have to be mentally healthy. And by prioritizing sleep, I'm hearing Dr. Mihalas talk about going for walks, prioritizing physical activity and prioritizing sleep and prioritizing family time and that connection time. I think everyone's kind of reevaluating their priorities and making, really committing to prioritizing self-care and family care is really important moving forward. And I say self-care and know that sometimes when we say that term, get eye rolls because they think about bubble baths and massages, but it's really about taking care of the needs of yourself and your family that is necessary for your overall well-being. And when we do those things, it not only improves our physical health, but it improves our mental health as well.
A lot of people, if they've been neglecting taking care of themselves, they may not even know what they really need to, be mentally healthy. So where could people start with that?
Being alone. I think a lot of the parents I know have not been alone for a long time. And when I find myself alone, ideas come. All of a sudden I'm creative, or I'm motivated to do something, or and it's very different, and it's not planned, but I find that it happens if I'm alone. So that's another thing you could schedule in.
Yeah. And scheduling, when you talk about those walks that Dr. Mihalas was talking about, and pairing that with that alone time, going on that walk by yourself would be an important thing that you could do for yourself, which would also be an act of self-care, to have that time to think and also to journal what it is that you're feeling, what it is that you're experiencing, what are the triggers to those emotions that you're experiencing. And I think that's important as well. And talk about if you're kind of assessing where you are, one of the things we can do is just monitor. I know we have devices and tools that can monitor our sleep, how much time we're spending in sleep, how often we're waking up in the middle of the night, whether we're moving, how many steps we took. So there's ways of measuring those things and then using that as a benchmark to what we need to do more of.
Or less of.
Yes.
There's
Absolutely.
on your phone. So I had a teenager say to me yesterday, I guess I did TikTok for 4 hours yesterday. And because I looked at my phone and that's what it said I did. And I think I was there for a couple of minutes. Like I really, maybe my phone's wrong, right? So, I mean, we could all be guilty of that probably in some ways, right? So being alone is not necessarily, checking your Facebook. I mean, it's, that's engaged with other people, right? So this is something different that we're talking about.
And we're at a point where people are always doing something, they have their phones with them at all times and always distracting or entertaining themselves. So I think for some, there's a lot of people that maybe aren't even comfortable being alone, just sitting with their own thoughts, sitting with themselves. I wonder how could someone who really that does make them uncomfortable, what do you recommend?
I would recommend you start slowly. It doesn't have to be committing to 60 minutes with yourself. It can be starting with a 1-minute meditation, and then a 5-minute meditation, and then a 10-minute walk. And so you start slowly, and you just increase that time over that length of time over time.
Mm-hmm. So mindfulness, meditation, do you think things like that are, prescriptive, that can really help people kind of build up and train themselves?
Yeah, when you asked your question, the first word that came to my mind was practice.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm sure any therapist can, remember many clients who are uncomfortable in the quiet space between the two of you when they're first getting used to therapy. It takes practice. It takes practice to sit alone with yourself, to turn off the music and not make a call, and just takes practice.
We talked about this a little bit earlier, but I kind of want to dive down a little deeper about relationships and how the distance of quarantine has allowed people some space and perspective to realize, that relationship isn't healthy for me, or I don't want to be part of that social group anymore. And that's a difficult thing to deal with, I would think, because right now you have this perfect excuse why you don't have to see people that you don't want to. But as we open up, we're going to have to face that and take steps. And so many people are not comfortable setting those kind of boundaries. What kind of advice do you have for dealing with that?
Dr. Mihalas, you better take this one on boundaries.
You've got
it just comes on over here. I think that first and foremost, it's important to reflect that the past year and a half has been difficult on everyone for so many reasons. I think it's triggered a lot of people because there's been just a traumatic soiree for everyone in terms of health compromised people who've been in oppressed and marginalized situations with the political unrest, with all the different things that have transpired. And so people may have acted in ways that maybe weren't themselves. And so I think possibly step one is to be a little bit compassionate if possible, and to consider that maybe people just were completely out of sorts, and to give time for people to settle back in. Because maybe you did see a side of someone that wasn't like them, but it's possible that they were traumatized, that they were triggered, and that maybe they can recalibrate and get back to a place that you can reconnect with them in a way that's suitable. Because there is a possibility that you were in a place that you resonated with them because they're the parent of your child's friend, and your child still wants to be very good friends with their child, and you don't want to have so much unrest that your child still can't be friends with their child. So you really do need to conceptualize the whole gestalt and zeitgeist of what transpired in the past year and a half. So I think kind of having compassion for the whole situation is step one. I think step two is kind of see if you can reconnect in any way, if that's possible. And then kind of step three is if you can't, start to see if there are new people that you can reconnect with and see why you're reconnecting them and what kind of camaraderie you have with them, shared interests, why you're connecting with them, and start to build new connections. But to kind of completely blast everyone that you used to know, I think may be pretty premature, even though you may want to do that. That would kind of be my recommendation as a starting point as you start to re-enter the community.
Mm-hmm. You know, the other thing that has happened is that for some people, they've really benefited from certain aspects of quarantine, from remote work or school, especially people with disabilities or mental illnesses such as, depression, social anxiety, or kids that are being bullied at school. There's different, so many different people that for whatever reason, they're just more comfortable with the way things have been. And they've actually been able to flourish because they finally had the accommodations they needed. And so now, how do they advocate for themselves within their work or their school to maintain that so they don't have to go back to the old way of doing things that just didn't work for them?
Yeah, I work with a lot of parents, and we do evaluations of children who are struggling with learning, processing, or social emotional challenges. And, many of those students were requesting accommodations, and they said it wasn't possible to get the kinds of accommodations that the parents were requesting. And now everybody had the accommodation, and including, access to, computers that had the teacher's lesson plan outlined. And so I think it's a good opportunity right now for parents to collaborate with teachers. I mean, teachers want to help. And I think conveying what it is that you've observed over the past year from observing your child learning, conveying to the teachers and educators what has worked, what has not worked. We said at the beginning that many students have flourished during this time. They've done better because they haven't had the distractions of a school environment. They haven't had the pressure of social interactions. And what can we take from those observations and what we've learned to help students moving forward, help children moving forward? So I think it begins with having a conversation with teachers and determining what that means in terms of modifications for this particular child or accommodations moving forward. I think for students who have an IEP or a 504 plan, it may mean making some adjustments and some changes to that plan based on the new information that we have over the past year. And for some parents, they were looking at their kids and seeing them struggle for the first time and now realizing the kind of things that they benefit from in terms of being at home. And that might mean that they need to seek out an evaluation or ask the school to conduct an assessment so that their child can get accommodations and modifications moving forward as we think about the next academic year. But it begins with having a discussion with teachers, sitting down and collaborating with them and making a plan for moving forward. And a lot of parents are going to have to use this time to advocate for their children and advocate for the children. And by doing that, you're actually modeling those self-advocacy skills for your kids.
Mm-hmm. Going back to kind of just maybe a simple thing. We talked about people having different levels of comfort with safety issues. And, there's a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear about, for some people, about just being in big groups again. They're not going to feel comfortable. What do you advise for, people that are dealing with that, especially if they're getting a lot of pressure from family members, coworkers, to kind of go out of their comfort zone from a safety perspective?
That's hard. I think that some of what we've said, applies to this question, right? So you've established your boundaries, your values, your priorities with your family or whoever's in your bubble. So you start there, like, okay, we think we know for today what we want, what we feel safe with. Um, and it was interesting. I was at a, drive-by birthday last weekend, come to the front yard kind of a thing. When we got there, there were 6 adults, 3 had masks, 3 did not.
Mhm.
And but we talked about it. It was an open discussion, like, so what are we doing here? Like, this is new, this is weird. I'm not wearing my mask. You're wearing a mask. What are you? And it was open and it was friendly, and it was fun. I would be surprised if anyone felt pressured. It was more of an exploration and a discussion. I understand that that's probably an ideal way to sort of enter back in, and that can't always happen. But there are groups of people, there are people who are okay to have that discussion with you. Certainly, people have been inviting people to do things and been receiving, no, we can't do it, we're not there yet, um, and getting various responses, right? We can obviously model a response that is empathic and flexible for the rest of the world, which is what we would like people to be with each other, right, at this time, and we're all kind of navigating it in our own ways. Um, and I think that if people are feeling pressured, again, I would say just stand back, right? How quickly do you need to make this decision? Does it have to be made now? Does it have to be made boldly? You know, um, how can you stick with what you believe? And I'm not going to say not make waves, because sometimes making waves is okay, but not if it makes you anxious, right? It really depends on the person. I mean, some people really should avoid making waves because it makes them anxious.
Mhm.
And some people should make more waves because they would feel less depressed or less anxious by asserting themselves. So it's so individual. It's hard to have a general response.
I agree. It's hard to have, like you're saying, to have that a generalization for everyone. But I think again, it comes back to having this is a golden opportunity because everybody is having these questions. Nobody knows what it is that they're supposed to do. So you can start with, I'm not sure about how to do this. I'd love to get together. What are you comfortable with?
Mhm.
This is what we're doing with our family, and see if that aligns. And then maybe you can have coffee, and maybe you can have a birthday party in a park. But it starts with a conversation, letting people know what you're comfortable with at this moment in time. It doesn't have to be forever, but at this time, this is what I'm comfortable with. What are you comfortable with? And then seeing again if there's alignment, and then exploring with them some things that you can do together.
So going with, I kind of want to switch to therapy. And during this pandemic, everything's switched online. And I'm just curious, what do you think the difference is between telehealth therapy and in person? Do you think that there are significant drawbacks? How do you picture the ideal situation moving forward? Dr. Mihalas, do you have any thoughts?
You can see my grin. I have to say, coming from a disability rights standpoint, I think that the advent of telehealth specifically has really increased access and accessibility, at least within the therapeutic arena and the medical arena. And so a lot of patients are able to access appointments much more than they would be able to, especially during the pandemic. So for transplant patients, immunocompromised, immunosuppressed patients, patients, for example, with type 1 diabetes, there are so many people who would not be able to safely get into an appointment actually able to get to all of their appointments because telehealth was available. Now, with a lot of policies and procedures that the Medicare, Medicaid, and insurance is trying to push forward, they're going to make telehealth much more difficult for patients who are still actually wanting it. So a lot of organizations are still trying to push for it, so there is still accessibility. But I think in terms of it being great for patients, still being able to access and get the benefit for it, it has been incredible. And a lot of patient rights organizations are still hoping that it will remain. Children, teens, and adults have all benefited. I think both Dr. King and Wilson can speak to testing and assessment and how that has worked out. But in terms of therapy and the medical model, patients have been able to access all their appointments quite well.
Mhm. Well, now it's time to open it up to the audience's questions. Let me see here. So we've got a question from Maureen, and she asks, spatial distancing has changed and becoming the normal. How do we respect the special distances that others may be offended by? So I guess, you know, comfort zones with your personal space.
I would suggest erring on the side of giving space. I think I think in the face of the unknown, we go that direction. It's the safest way, it's the most respectful way, and you can read other people's body language if they're more comfortable. So I think we can, that's what I would say. Start with space, read how it's going, and go from there.
Do you think people have to be cautious with even things like, you know, handshakes and different things, you know, a hug when you see someone?
I think we're still there.
Okay.
I think we're still in the place where we should say, you know, yes, can I hug you, or things like that.
All right. I have a question from Lois. She has an 8-year-old grandchild who's autistic and traumatized. He's a lot different than he was before. And she's wondering how they can come up with healthy new habits that he's comfortable with.
Can she be more specific, like give 1 or 2 examples of what is different?
Lois, if you're there, type some examples in the chat. Do you want to wait and then
Yeah.
come back? Okay. All right. Lisa, she'd like to hear from Dr. Wilson about finding out some people used to, oh, okay. How do you handle it when you find out that some people used to socialize with have racist views, and how to navigate those situations?
I love how that's asked to me. But I understand it. I get it. I think again, you have to pause and think about, what does that relationship do for you? And knowing this information about them, how does this relationship moving forward continue to serve you? And how does this impact the way you feel about yourself, your family, the things that you value? Because there may be a disconnect between your values and the value of that person. And you have to kind of think about what it is that you need. And again, it comes back to self-care. You may not need people in your life who have those kinds of views that impact your health and the health of your family. And so that may be a very easy decision, that this isn't a relationship that no longer serves you, and you don't want to continue moving forward. And, Dr. Mihalas talked earlier about maybe this was, a traumatic response, and it's been a stressful time, and people may have acted in a way that they wouldn't have acted normally. Or maybe that for some people, these are views that they've always had that were suppressed, and now they're coming forward. And so now you have to think about whether or not that is the type of person you want to continue to have in your life moving forward, or is it going to be a form of some toxicity in your life that you don't want to have moving forward. So I think those are things to think about. And again, make decisions for what is best for you and your family moving forward, and not think about what it means for that person.
I think that we also forget that we have choice in peer relationships. We get into a relationship and we don't think about it, or there's this underlying assumption, well, we've been friends for 20 years, or and I think a healthier way to be in peer relationships is to continue to reevaluate what this person brings to my life, what they take from my life, what they take from me. Even if you're married to that person, I think the healthiest marriages are the ones where we reevaluate consistently if we still like this person. My husband will say he does it every day. That's a lot. I can't think if I like him every day. That's a lot of work. Maybe like once a week, I'll evaluate, is this relationship working for me? And I think it helps us not take people for granted. It's a good thing. But we don't do it very often. I don't think it's a common practice that we look at our relationships in that way and think, do I want this? Do I want in still? But you can.
And I think with ourselves too, right? I mean, I think it goes back to that thing we've been talking about the whole time. Like, how are we also reevaluating ourselves and our relationship with ourselves? Like, is what we're doing and how we're dealing, interpersonally and interpersonally with other people. Like, is this working? Like, how am I navigating the world? Like, am I functioning day to day, week to week, month to month well, or do I need to do something differently? So I think it's at like various different levels, both micro and macro. Like, how am I doing too? Because that will also relate to how I'm relating to other people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right, Lois has gotten back to us. So her grandson, he doesn't like to hug or look people in the eyes. His mother was a frontline worker. Parents were really affected. So, I think even in general, what would you say to that with kids that have really changed?
Am I taking?
Yeah.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. So again, with the caveat that this is not psychotherapeutic advice, but there are a couple things that you can do. If you really feel like your child has changed such that they're not able to complete activities of daily living, they're not kind of functioning day to day with academics, not able to connect with other people, then you can kind of consider, is this time to get psychotherapeutic support? And it's really important to consider that so they don't decompensate more, that they regress more to their daily functioning. So that's kind of like one thing to really consider. Do they need actual mental health or professional support? Once you consider that, you can kind of look online and look for resources. There are a number of resources that have recently been published, and this you can actually go to Child Nexus, Dr. Wilson's website. She recently put online there a number of resources for parents and caregivers like yourself, Lois, to how to help children post-pandemic. There's a recent book that was published that gives both virtual and in-person support for children of how to cope with the trauma and stress post-pandemic. So you may want to go to childnexus.org. .com and look on there. Literally, you will find probably 50 to 60 resources on there. You can also go to Amazon.com and type in children and post-pandemic support, and you will find workbooks on there. You can also talk to your school psychologist or go to NASPonline.org. That's the National Association for School Psychologists. They also have a number of resources on there that can give you step-by-step guidance on how to work with children and trauma as a caregiver.
You've just mentioned a bunch of great resources, and I think just to help everybody who is watching, we will gather those together and send them out in a follow-up email so you have those. All right, I think we have time for just a few more questions. This question is from Johanna. It's about burnout and stress. And she's asking, how can we recognize when we're at our limit, and how can you recognize when you're normalizing like a toxic level of stress?
I think one of the ways that you can identify it is one, if you feel it. So a lot of people report feeling it in your body. You can really feel a change, either the sweaty palms or your heart rate increasing, a lot of those physiological signs that we see associated with anxiety as well. But then you also see things like changes in your sleep, changes in your appetite. Those are things that can also suggest that you're having some emotional response to a stressor. And then it's a change from what it was before. And stress is important to keep track of and to be mindful of, because it can absolutely impact your physical health and your mental health. We know that, high levels of stress release cortisol. Cortisol can damage brain cells, the brain cells that are important for learning and memory and for paying attention and for doing all the things that you typically do on a daily basis. And it can also be a precursor to anxiety and depression. And so I think realizing that you're experiencing it, because there are a lot of thoughts that are associated with the stressors that we experience, and then recognize that it's impacting you in a specific way. A lot of times it is a disturbance in sleep. It is a change in appetite. It's doing things that you would normally not do. Maybe you're spending an hour more a day on Netflix, and that's not something that you would normally do. You usually jump out of bed at 6 a.m. and now it's 7 a.m., 8 a.m. You're staying in bed a little bit longer. You're ruminating on things that you're worried about or concerned about. So those are all signs that you can be experiencing some levels of stress. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is if you're a parent, that your stress is directly linked to your child's stress. So parents who report high levels of stress, when they measure the cortisol levels in their children, they have higher cortisol levels. So even though your children may not be saying, I'm experiencing high levels of stress right now, they can be experiencing the stress of their parents. And so the best thing that parents can do is to recognize that you're having this response and then address it. And there's a number of ways you can address it. Dr. Mihalas talked about psychotherapy. We've talked about meditation and mindfulness, making sure you're getting exercise, making sure you're talking about the things that you're experiencing, because when you address your stress levels, you address the stress levels of your entire family, which enhances everyone's well-being when it's under control.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're feeling burnout, it depends, I guess, if it's so are you burned out at work, and which is a job that you don't have control over, versus work where you might have some control over your job. So I think that looking at can I change anything here, right? So am I burned out because there's something that I can control that I'm not doing, right? Can I hire that out, get some support here, ask somebody else to do that, do one less hour this day? So just looking at things like that too, I think can help if burnout is the issue.
Mm-hmm. We have a question from John. How should we respond when people try to force their opinions or mindset onto us out of their fears, and they feel like a difficult situation permits that? So I guess, yes, bad behavior and using pandemic stress as an excuse. What are your thoughts?
It's tough.
Dr. Wilson, do you have any thoughts about that?
I mean, it's so multi-layered in terms of, responding to that, because, at one point on one level, you don't accept bad behavior in your life. And when people have differences of opinion, you acknowledge the fact that we differ in opinion by just acknowledging the fact that we are not going to agree on this issue. And we've seen that over the past year in terms of the political unrest that Dr. Mihalas mentioned over the past year. People have very different views. People who have looked at the same thing can experience it very differently. And you might get to a point where you're not going to come together and agree. You're not going to make the person agree with you. And maybe the realization that that is not the goal. The goal might be hearing the person, you understand it this way, I understand it this way, and this is where we are. And our beliefs are different. And then you decide how to move forward with that. But maybe changing the goal from making someone feel the way you do to just acknowledging that you feel differently, you see things differently, you maybe even experience the world differently. And that's where you begin.
And there are certainly families who I know of where certain members have said there's been a lot of trouble with this, and then people say, okay, we can't talk about this anymore. Sometimes that works. Sometimes if people can be a little rule bound, right, we can still have our relationship, or we can still do whatever we're doing and getting together, or you watching my kid or whatever it is, but we can't talk about this. And sometimes that's enough to maintain the relationship or maintain what you're getting from the relationship. And you can just reduce the stress after you've acknowledged, obviously, we see this differently. Sometimes that doesn't work, but it can be one of the things in your toolbox.
Do we have any last questions from the audience? I think we have time for one more if somebody has one. Oh, here. Oh, this is an interesting one from Deborah. How do you go about having friends again when you've forgot how to make them because of the pandemic? That's a good question. I think a lot of people are feeling awkwardness and anxiety about socialization again.
And dating.
Yes,
I do
dating.
not envy those who were trying to date in the last year and a half.
So at least where I'm starting with some of the pediatric population that I see is we're watching videos. We're watching TV shows together. We're watching Netflix just to like get in the groove and make it light and remind us like, what is it like to go out to eat? What is it like to have a coffee date? Just to get in the groove and remember. Because jumping straight into something without being reminded cognitively and jogging our schemas and mental models of things sets us up for failure. So step one is just like have fun, watch movies, remember what it's like to socialize. And then from there, do something with someone that you're very familiar with. So if you fall flat on your face, it really doesn't matter. And make it short and brief. So set something up with your best friend maybe, or a colleague that you've worked with for a couple of years, and maybe set up a 30-minute coffee date or even a walk where you don't need that much conversation going, but like you're doing something. So it's kind of paced, and know upfront with that person, hey, I'm feeling nervous. Let them know where you're at so there's a degree of vulnerability and authenticity, because probably they feel the same way too. They've been in the same boat as you. And then after that kind of brief stint, you can maybe with that same person kind of stretch it out a little bit longer. So then you increase kind of your self-efficacy and self-esteem that you can do it. And then after you kind of have created that bubble for yourself with that person, now you can extend it to another person that maybe you don't know as well. You feel good, and then you can now start to create more and more networks of people, places, and things that you're doing things with.
I just want to highlight really quickly, I think it's just such great guidance to think about taking a walk, or a shared activity is such an easier way to come back into this than sitting across the table from someone and chatting for 90 minutes, right? So a shared interest where you're next to each other, looking out, which is also how we're supposed to talk to kids about tough subjects too, right? So we know that we don't have to make eye contact when we're doing something together, both sort of looking out at the world and from the same vantage point, it's easier to relate. It's easier to talk.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you for that. That's all the time we have for today. Thanks again to Dr. King, Dr. Wilson, and Dr. Mihalas. And thank you all for joining us. We hope that today's discussion helps for a smoother transition back to your new normal.